Somewhere right now in a garage, a spare bedroom, a small repair shop tucked between a laundromat and a phone store, someone is booting up a computer that Microsoft officially declared dead. And in the next 90 seconds, you're going to understand why that quiet, unglamorous moment might be the single biggest shift in personal computing in 30 years. Because in October 2025, Microsoft pulled the plug on Windows 10, and they expected exactly what every corporation expects when it retires. An old product, a wave of grumbling, a mild news cycle, and millions of people quietly buying new laptops with Windows 11 pre-installed. And for most of the world, that is precisely what happened, but underneath that obvious headline in the data, nobody was watching closely enough. Something else was happening at the exact same moment. An operating system that has been mocked, dismissed, and buried in punchlines since the early 2000s started climbing at a speed it has never climbed at before. And this is not a rumor pulled from a forum thread. This is not blind loyalty from open source diehards who have said the same thing every year since 2008. This is verified market data from independent tracking firms, all pointing the same direction, all landing in the exact window Microsoft assumed it had the desktop locked down for good. So let's start with the number that should be keeping someone at Microsoft awake at night. Because in April 2026, Linux reached 2.99% of the global desktop market according to StatCounter. And on its own, that number sounds almost embarrassingly small until you realize that back in July 2022, Linux was sitting at 2.76% and had barely moved for years. Flat, stagnant, a rounding error. And then Windows 10 died, and the line on the chart didn't just tick upward, it broke its own decade-long pattern, with some trackers showing global share brushing 4.7% during the transition, and the United States crossing 5% for the first time in its entire history. And to understand how strange that curve actually is, consider this. It took Linux roughly 10 years to climb from 1% to 2% of the desktop market. And it took less than 12 months to climb from 3% to 4%. That is not gradual growth. That is the signature of a forced event slamming into a product that had finally become good enough to catch the people falling out of Microsoft's ecosystem. And the thing doing the pushing has a name, Windows. 11's hardware requirements, because Microsoft didn't just end support for an old operating system, it mandated a security chip called TPM 2.0 and a strict list of approved processors. And the result was that tens of millions of computers, machines that still ran fast, still opened a browser, still handled a spreadsheet or a video call without complaint, were suddenly told by the company that built them that they were obsolete, not broken. Not slow, just disqualified by a checklist. And if your laptop was bought before roughly 2018, there is a very real chance Windows 11 will simply refuse to install on it, no matter how well it still performs. And Microsoft's answer to this was almost insultingly simple. Buy a new one, and for a company sitting on one of the most profitable software empires ever built. Telling tens of millions of loyal customers to spend more money at the exact moment the global hardware market turned brutal might be the costliest miscalculation Microsoft has made on the desktop in over a decade. Because here's the part that makes the timing almost cruel. While Windows 10 was dying, DRAM prices were surging by more than 170% year over year heading into 2026. A DDR5 memory kit that cost around $100 in the middle of 2025 was pushing close to $200 within months. SSD prices climbed right alongside it. GPU. Prices kept rising as manufacturers throttled production. And so picture the exact moment millions of ordinary Windows 10 users were told their perfectly good machines were finished. It was the single worst moment in years to be told you needed to spend money you didn't plan on spending. And that is the precise moment a free alternative that runs beautifully on old hardware stops, looking like a hobbyist's side project and starts looking like the only rational financial decision on the table. And this is where Linux stops being a philosophy and becomes an argument written in dollars and cents, because installing it costs nothing, no license fee, no subscription, no upgrade tax hiding in the fine print, and because most Linux distributions are dramatically lighter on system resources than Windows 11, the exact same decade-old laptop that chokes and stutters under Windows can run smooth and responsive under something like Linux Mint or Zorin OS. And people who tried this for themselves kept describing the same strange feeling. A machine they were ready to throw in a drawer suddenly felt new again. A desktop that Microsoft had officially declared incompatible with its own future could keep running securely, indefinitely, for zero additional spending. And once that math becomes obvious to someone standing in front of a $600 price tag, ideology has nothing to do with the decision anymore. But numbers alone don't cause a migration this size. Someone has to build the bridge people actually walk across. And that's where a campaign called End of 10 enters the story, quietly backed by names like Debian, Fedora, GNOME, KDE, and Zorin. And their entire pitch was deliberately unglamorous. They weren't trying to convert anyone to open source. Ideology, they were connecting ordinary, non-technical people with local volunteers and repair cafes willing to physically install a new operating system on the machine already sitting in front of them. And this mattered more than it sounds, because the single biggest psychological wall standing between an average person and switching operating systems has never been the software itself. It has always been the paralysis of not knowing which version of Linux to even choose. An end of tens message cuts straight through that fear. It doesn't matter which one, just pick something, will help you get there. And that kind of low-friction, distro-agnostic outreach is exactly the mechanism that turns curiosity into an actual installed user base instead of one more abandoned browser tab. And one distribution in particular ran away with the moment, Zorin OS, built specifically for people coming straight from Windows or Mac, reported more than 780,000 Windows users switching around the Windows 10 deadline alone, and in one 5-week stretch after support ended, Zorin logged a full 1 million downloads. And the reason it pulled so far ahead of everything else is almost embarrassingly simple. It looks and feels like Windows. Its newest version even lets a brand new user flip their entire desktop to resemble Windows 10, Windows 11, or Mac OS with a single click. And it ships with detection for more than 240 common Windows programs, automatically suggesting the closest Linux alternative the moment someone tries to open something that doesn't exist there. In other words, Zorin never asked people to learn a new language. It met them exactly where they already stood and walked them somewhere else, one small, familiar step at a time. And if you think this story only lives on personal laptops, the institutional side is arguably even more dramatic. Because governments, the kind of organizations that almost never move fast on technology, started treating Linux as a strategic necessity rather than a curiosity in an era of escalating digital espionage and cyber conflict. More. Countries are explicitly choosing Linux because it frees them from total dependency on a single foreign company's software stack, no lock-in to one vendor's pricing, one company's update schedule, one company's data practices, and privacy sits right next to that strategic logic. Because critics have long pointed out that proprietary systems collect telemetry that isn't always transparent about what's gathered or where it travels, and Linux hands that control directly back to whoever is running it. What gets collected, how it's stored, who's allowed to see it. And for any nation with strict data protection laws on the books, that isn't a footnote, that's a sovereignty issue. And this argument hit even harder once people understood what Windows 11 had quietly built into itself, a feature called Recall, which takes continuous screenshots of a user's activity to build a searchable history explicitly designed to feed background AI systems. And for a huge number of people that crossed a line they didn't know was there until it already had. Most major Linux distributions simply do not track usage, do not sell behavioral data, do not force a cloud account down your throat during setup, and there's no silent AI assistant logging your screen without you ever agreeing to it. And the people who switched specifically because of Recall weren't reacting to some abstract fear. They were reacting to a real, named, documented feature doing exactly what they were afraid of. And then there's the argument that, for decades, was Linux's single greatest weakness, gaming. Because if you wanted to play modern titles, Linux simply wasn't a serious option. Full stop. And that excuse barely survives contact with reality anymore, thanks to one company's relentless investment in a compatibility layer called Proton. Somewhere between 89 and 90% of all Windows games now launch and run on Linux, and ProtonDB's own testing found 42% of brand new releases earn the highest possible compatibility rating, sometimes running with noticeably higher minimum frame rates, simply because Linux carries less background overhead, and Steam's own hardware survey backs this up in a way that's almost hard to believe. Linux crossed 5% of all Steam users in March 2026, the single largest monthly jump the platform has ever recorded in its entire history. Applied against Steam's roughly 132 million monthly active users, that percentage works out to something close to 7 million people gaming on Linux in a single month, a number that used to round down to nothing. Now it's a demographic Valve has to design for. And the engine behind a huge chunk of that shift has a very specific name, the Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming PC that runs Linux by default, meaning every single unit sold is quietly another Linux installation out in the wild, whether its owner ever thinks about it that way or not. And with shipments reaching somewhere around 5.6 million units, and Valve continuing to invest in both the hardware and the software underneath it, SteamOS remains the single most used Linux variant across the entire Steam ecosystem. But here's the detail that actually matters more than the headline number. Its share of the Linux total has been quietly shrinking even as the overall number climbs, because gaming-focused desktop distributions built on Arch and Fedora have been picking up ground even faster. which means this isn't just Steam Deck owners being counted as Linux users by default anymore. Actual desktop gamers are choosing to install Linux gaming distributions on regular computers on purpose, because the experience finally earns it. And if you only hear this timeline in fragments, it genuinely undersells itself. Linux gaming sat around 3.2% of Steam's user base toward the end of 2025, itself an all-time high, and the first moment Linux had ever passed macOS on the platform. And just 3 months later, in March 2026, that number had nearly doubled to 5.33%. While Windows lost more than 4 full percentage points of Steam users in that same single month, a swing that size almost never happens naturally in a market as mature and saturated as PC. Gaming, it happens when something external breaks the equilibrium, and the Windows 10 shutdown colliding with Windows 11's hardware wall is exactly that kind of shock. This means Windows is dying, and anyone telling you otherwise is overselling the story for clicks. Windows still commands somewhere around 63 to 66% of the entire global desktop market. An enormous lead that isn't collapsing in a single migration cycle, plenty of professional software, certain Adobe tools, and a long list of competitive games protected by anti-cheat systems like Easy Anti-Cheat and BattlEye still don't run properly on Linux, and anti-cheat compatibility remains the single most common reason serious competitive gamers stay put, despite everything else pointing the other direction. So this isn't the long-mocked year of the Linux desktop finally arriving in some dramatic total takeover, and Linux's own community has spent 2 decades openly mocking that exact phrase. Plenty of them are still mocking it today because false dawns have piled up for 30 straight years. But here's the distinction that actually separates this moment from every previous false alarm. For 30 years, Linux's growth pitch was built almost entirely on developer enthusiasm and ideological appeal, open source values, customization, community over corporation. And that pitch moved the number from essentially 0 to maybe 2% across 2 full decades. It never broke into the mainstream because the average person simply never cared about any of that. What's happening now is different in kind, not just in degree. The reasons people are switching today are boring, practical, and financial. Their hardware still works and they refuse to throw it away. Memory and storage prices doubled and they can't justify an upgrade right now. They don't want a screenshot. Logging feature quietly running in the background of their own life, and their game library finally works. Without a single asterisk attached, none of that requires anyone to believe in open source as a cause. It only requires someone to do basic math about their own situation. And for the first time in Linux's history, that math is landing in its favor for a real, measurable slice of the population. And there's a layer to this story almost nobody talks about because it never shows up in a flashy headline. The part of computing that stopped competing with Windows years ago because it had already quietly won. Every single one of the world's top 500 supercomputers runs Linux, an unbroken streak, now stretching 8 consecutive years. Linux now powers an estimated 51.3% of all server operating systems worldwide, up from under 45% just 2 years earlier. And among the top 1 million websites on the internet, more than 96% of the servers hosting them run Linux. The cloud tells the exact same story. Google Cloud reports over 91% of its virtual machines running Linux. Amazon Web Services sits above 83%. And even Microsoft's own cloud platform, Azure, runs more than 60% of its workloads on Linux instead of Windows Server. A strange, almost poetic irony worth sitting with for a second. The company that built its empire on Windows licensing fees is quietly running the majority of its own cloud infrastructure on the very operating system it spent 30 years trying to outmarket. And this infrastructure dominance is exactly why the desktop surge you just watched unfold isn't some fragile blip that vanishes. The second the last Windows 10 straggler finishes migrating, Linux was never starting from zero. It was already the invisible backbone of the entire internet. And it's only now, finally. Clawing back ground on the one screen, ordinary people actually stare at every single day. Their own desktop and the mobile world tells the same story from a different angle. Android, built directly on the Linux kernel, holds roughly 67% of the entire global mobile market. And combine it with iOS, and you cover nearly every smartphone on the planet, meaning most human beings carrying a phone in their pocket right now are already, technically, running a Linux-based system without ever knowing or caring. And enterprise adoption quietly tells the same underreported story. Red Hat. Enterprise Linux leads large-scale deployments with just over 43% share. Ubuntu follows at nearly 34%, with Debian and SUSE rounding things out. Kubernetes production adoption has climbed to 82% among surveyed organizations, and the overwhelming majority of those clusters run on Linux rather than any Windows-based alternative. None of that registers when someone glances at a desktop chart and shrugs at 3%. But it's the financial and technical bedrock underneath everything else in this story, and it's exactly why so many developers, engineers, and IT professionals never needed convincing to switch their personal machines too. They'd already been living inside Linux at work every single day. The desktop migration wave simply gave millions of everyday people a reason to finally meet the operating system. Their own employer's servers had been quietly running on the whole time, and when you put every piece of this together, the picture becomes almost impossible to ignore. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't some coordinated marketing blitz, because Linux famously doesn't have a marketing budget to begin with. This was timing, economics, restrictive hardware policy, growing privacy anxiety, and a gaming compatibility gap that finally closed after years of engineering work funded by one company that actually cared enough to finish the job. Remove any single piece of that puzzle, and the surge probably looks far smaller. Remove the Windows 10 shutdown date, and there's no forced decision point. Remove the hardware price spike, and the financial argument loses most of its teeth. Remove Proton and the Steam Deck, and the gaming objection never gets solved. Every one of those pressures landed inside the same 12-month window, almost like a storm assembled by accident, and Linux happened to be ready, polished, and waiting at the exact moment it needed to be. And the next chapter of this fight was never really about Windows 10 in the first place. It's about what happens the moment Windows 11 announces its next mandatory feature, the moment hardware prices spike again, the moment the next wave of users staring down a forced upgrade decides to look somewhere else first instead of last. And based on everything you just watched happen in a single year, Linux is finally standing exactly where it needs to be to take that opening the second it arrives.